If you've heard me preach very often, you will have likely heard me say that prejudice becomes its own logic. 40 years ago, when reporters finally got the nerve to raise the issue with the Reagan administration, that a great deal of what Ronald Reagan said in his public speeches was comprised primarily of what I like to call balloon juice. His administration coined a way too precious response that the president had simply misspoken, which boiled down to tell any lie you want to tell in public, and then in private, when confronted about it, some aide will simply wave it off as some kind of oratory stumble. 40 years later, we have Donald Trump, and his aide, Kellyanne Conway, came up with a truly creative phrase in which she said that Donald Trump's obvious fictions were alternative truths. That insult was so absurd that I think it was only used once. I think even Kellyanne realized that she could only say that one time. Still, the assumption that truth is relative to what I want to believe or what my favorite person says is still an assumption that lives in American minds. It falls under the heading of my uninformed opinion is just as good as your well-researched and reasoned opinion formed through critical thinking. It's not a uniquely American problem, as I'll get into in a few minutes, nor is it even a novel modern issue. For instance, when white European settlers came to the Americas, they very quickly concluded that the same natives who had saved them from starving to death, who had introduced them to indigenous crops, were now savages whose very lives could be dispatched with at whim. However, no one less than our brilliant founding father, Ben Franklin, noted that while an awful lot of white folks would leave to go live with the Indians, that they virtually never saw an Indian who would come and live with the white folks. He wrote, "When an Indian child has been brought up among us, taught our language, habituated to our customs, yet if he goes to see his relations and makes one Indian ramble with them, there is no persuading them to return." Now, you might think that a factual observation like that would have begun to challenge the prejudice that settlers had towards Native Americans. But open warfare continued for another century, and prejudice around Native reservations remains to this day, all of which could very legitimately make a reasonable person wonder, who are the savages here? Of course, we've talked a lot about the early American practice of enslaving Africans, but it should be noted that while it was a common practice in the early days of the colonies, even then there were those who were objecting on moral grounds. Ben Franklin was a slave owner himself, but Franklin put up the money to bring an impoverished journalist named Thomas Paine to America, and shortly after arriving, Paine published an anonymous article in a Pennsylvania newspaper before the Revolutionary War condemning slavery. This is kind of a longish quote, but I'd like for you to hear what Thomas Paine wrote 240 years ago. "Are traders in men an unnatural commodity, must know the wickedness of the slave trade, if they attend to reasoning or the dictates of their own hearts, and such as shun and stifle all these willfully sacrifice their conscience and the character of integrity to that golden idol. The managers of the trade themselves and others testify that many of these African nations inhabit fertile countries, are industrious farmers, enjoy plenty, and lived quietly, averse to war, before Europeans debauched them with liquors and bribing them against one another, and that these inoffensive people are brought into slavery by stealing them, tempting kings to sell their subjects, which they have no right to do, and hiring one tribe to war against another in order to catch prisoners. By such wicked and inhuman ways, the English are said to enslave towards 100,000 yearly, of which 30,000 are supposed to die by barbarous treatment in the first year. Besides all that, are slain in the unnatural ways excited to take them. So much innocent blood have the managers and supporters of this inhuman trade to answer for to the common Lord of all. You see, the logic of the moral nightmare that was African slavery was well known, it was broadly published, and it was discussed long before our nation was founded. And yet, our first president, George Washington, held more than 300 slaves at Mount Vernon. Thomas Jefferson had more than 600 at Monticello. And in fact, a dozen of our first presidents were slave owners, including Ulysses S. Grant, who led the Union armies during the Civil War. Washington, Madison, Monroe, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Polk, Tyler, Johnson, and Grant were all, at least at one time, slave owners. If you see a nauseatingly redundant theme in this set of photographs, spoiler alert, there are no pleasant surprises in the next 100 years of pictures. Abolitionist ideology was more than available to all of these great, intelligent, and powerful people, all of whom committed what you have heard me refer to in the past as an application bias. That is, it may be generally true, but it doesn't apply to me. Or, well, you have your opinion, and I have mine. Prejudice, as I have said, has its own logic, a logic that can deny facts and completely dismiss reason. Most Western countries ended slavery at the ballot box through civil reparations and moral decision-making. The USA did it at the point of a bayonet, unfortunately through a war that still stands as our most deadly per capita war of our history. It was obvious to anyone who cared to think about it that slavery was wrong, but it took a bloody civil war to overcome that national prejudice. What's been talked about less was that as the slave trade from Africa was dying off, those old slave ships simply went around to the Asian coast and began, they were called coolie ships at the time, they began to capture Asians to labor in the New World. As they were forced to awaken to the cruelty and morally intolerable enslavement of Africans, Asians were introduced as a new racial group who didn't speak English and could be treated like farm animals. In fact, the term to be shanghaied came into being as these ship captains would cruise along the rural areas of China's coast and tell the inhabitants that they could get a high-paying job in Shanghai if they would just get on the boat and come with them, only to find themselves waking up in a slave camp in America building our railroad system. Though Lincoln officially outlawed the coolie trade at about the same time as the African slaves were liberated, still history shows that 9 out of 10 of the laborers who built our transcontinental railroad system were Asians. Prejudice, you see, has its own logic. Even though it was illegal, somehow the Asians didn't rank as human beings. Defies reason, evidence, education, and information. But we passed from the 19th century to the 20th and encountered a sudden explosion of anti-Semitic prejudice, and not just in Germany, but throughout Russia and most of Europe, and we have to admit, to no small degree, in America. While the Holocaust is the macro, big picture of that era, I want to bring this conversation down to just one person who was a major player in the war that brought the Holocaust to an end. We began today with a wisdom lesson taken from the New York Times article that was published last summer about Alan Turing, a British mathematician and one of the originators of the earliest computers, who was, by the way, portrayed brilliantly by Benedict Cumberbatch in the 2014 movie, The Imitation Game. That's germane to nothing, has nothing to do with the sermon, other than the fact that I'm just a huge fan of Benedict Cumberbatch. If the world were a more just place, on any one short list of those who were crucial to winning World War II, Alan Turing would be listed with Einstein and Oppenheimer. But even though he was the one who broke the German Enigma code and set up the necessary math and engineering for the invention of the computer, Turing has been ignored in most historical accounts because he was a homosexual. And in fact, in 1952, he was put on trial in Great Britain under the charge of being gay. And it may well be, even the people that put him on trial knew that we may have lost World War II without him. Hitler might have succeeded in global domination. However, this brilliant hero was put on trial by our British cousins for being gay. And being found guilty, he was given a choice between either going to prison or chemical castration. And he chose instead to commit suicide. This is not, men and women, ancient Athens condemning Socrates to death. This isn't even 18th century France sending Voltaire into exile. This is 20th century England, within the memory of many of you, condemning one of history's greatest geniuses for the crime of being gay. And it took the United Kingdom 55 years to apologize for this miscarriage of justice, waiting, of course, until everyone involved was dead and no one had to be shamed for what they had done. Still, right up into recent history, we've only gradually granted legal marriage status to same-sex marriages, starting in the year 2000 in the Netherlands, 2003 in Belgium, in 2005 it was Canada and Spain, in South Africa in 2006, Norway, Sweden, and Iceland were next in 2008, 2009, 2010, England in 2013, and sanity arrived in America not until 2015. Prejudice dies slowly. It resists reason and ethical debate, which is why some people still listening to blowhards like Rush Limbaugh complaining that gay marriage might undermine the spiritual sanctity of any one of his 4 marriages. That is some hardcore, undiluted hypocrisy right there. Taking moral advice from Rush Limbaugh is similar to taking medical advice from Donald Trump. There have been 3 known fatalities this week in a VA sampling of the malaria drug, and that was before he even suggested injecting disinfectants. And though we have made progress, we should not confuse progress with success. We might want to feel that the genocide against the Native Americans is buried in history, but you've heard me talk about my trip to the Standing Rock Sioux reservation in North Dakota, where it doesn't look like prejudice has died at all. I witnessed atrocities there that I wouldn't have believed could have happened in the past century. And yes, we did end slavery. We even integrated schools and a few years ago elected a black president. But don't kid yourself. Racial prejudice against black and brown people in America is anything but over. And I fear that what we are doing in our criminal justice system, in the prisons, and you'll recall 6 weeks ago I talked about the likelihood of COVID-19 spreading within prisons because they are all overcrowded and the people are given no reprieve from being up against each other. And now, if you're paying attention to the news, you see that the 2 places where most people are dying are nursing homes and prisons. I fear that what we are doing to black people in prison in America is morally possibly worse than what they were doing with slavery in the 19th century. And that is a huge statement to make, but it is horrible. Anti-Semitism is better, but it's not over. And gay rights have come a long way, but the prejudice has not ended, or we wouldn't have so many prominent people in big pulpits or elected officials who are still pretending to be straight, Mike Pence. But who am I to speculate about things like that? Prejudice often lives side by side with burgeoning acceptance and change. My daughter and her friends never miss an installment of RuPaul's Drag Race. But at the same time, of the nearly 30 transgender Americans who were murdered last year in America, almost all of them were black women. The Human Rights Commission already lists 6 more trans black women that were killed this year, and we're in the coronavirus lockdown, where there's not even that many people out. And still, transgender people are targeted for murder. Folks, prejudice survives on 2 things: the fear of people who are different from us and ignorance, the refusal to learn, to grow, and to understand that being Native American or black or Latinx or Jewish or gay or trans is not a reason for fear or hatred, or for that matter, is it any of your business? I'm kind of waiting for the day when I can buy a rubber stamp that just says, none your business. And when I get a form that asks what my race is, none your business. And when it asks for my gender, none your business. It's not that my race or gender is all that difficult to spot. It's not that I'm hiding something or keeping a secret. It isn't even that I have anything to apologize for regarding my race or gender, other than maybe the outrageous moral blindness found in my peer group, which includes 43 of the first 43 presidents of the United States. But I really don't want you to get lost on that thought. We had an old joke when I was a philosophy major in college back in the 70s. A philosopher and his wife go to the hospital to have their first child. The wife gives birth, looks up at her husband and says, "Is it a boy or a girl?" And he says, "Yes," which was hilarious to us in the 1970s when gender was just a binary universe. Now that philosopher would need to update that response to, well, yes and no, or maybe, or some of both, or it depends. But in many such matters, what all of us need to accept is just to keep calm and remember that it is none of your business. Hating trans people for being trans makes no more sense than hating blacks for being black, hating Asians for being Asian, hating Jews for being Jewish, or hating gay people for being gay. Somehow in 2020, we've arrived at a point where it's still okay in many people's minds to hate trans people for being trans. And I'm begging you to see that it's just like all the other prejudices that we have fought and tried to rid ourselves of. No matter how far we've come, no matter how much prejudice we've defeated, erased, expelled, or put to bed, it just seems like we've always got work to do, like this sign outside of a snow-covered Swedish coffee shop illustrates. The sign says, "Because we welcome all colors, all sexes, all orientations, all religions, all cultures, all abilities, all ages, all sizes, except the Danish." Because, folks, we will always have our work cut out for us.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.